As the temps start rising, I feel the familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or for just one season. Thankfully, Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. The best part is that Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes, so you get to look good while feeling good. I'm pretty excited that I have upgraded my athleisure wardrobe for this summer. I bought a sweatshirt and a pair of wide-leg flow pants that are two of the softest items I own, and I plan to live in them. So join me in giving your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
Other people might not notice the chaos that is underneath the surface, sort of like a duck that serenely kind of sails across the surface, and underneath the water, what we don't see is the level of effort and energy expended to keep that duck afloat. And that is often what it feels like for high-striving, burnt-out perfectionists, and also for ADHD women, because I just have to hide the chaos that's underneath because of the way society criticizes and belittles and shames people for when they can't do proper adulting.
That was Michaela Thomas on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are 4 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, and author of Act for Burnout, Act Daily Journal, and the Act Daily Card Deck.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and author of an upcoming book on being a better conversationalist and making friends.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hi, everyone. This is Debbie. I'm bringing you a conversation today with Michaela Thomas about ADHD and what ADHD looks like, and specifically focusing on women with kind of a late diagnosis of ADHD, but it's also more generally about ADHD. And I'm here with Emily to talk about the upcoming episode. Emily, let's discuss.
Yeah, I was actually really excited you decided to take on this topic. I think it's really timely. And, if anything, we are surrounded now by kind of the TikTok version of mental health, right? And I think there are upsides and downsides to that.
Right. What are some of the downsides? You tell me the downsides in your opinion. I'll cover the upsides.
Okay. Well, I think there's that tendency to overdiagnose yourself and just think, oh, that sounds like me. I have this diagnosis. And I think ADHD is especially tricky because there are so many features of it that people think of when they think of ADHD that look certain way on the surface, but actually have nothing to do with the actual diagnosis. But it's easy to think, well, I'm really forgetful, or I get distracted really easily, or I have trouble getting organized, and think maybe I have ADHD. And I think the downside is the oversimplification of actual diagnosis and kind of this overgeneralization of symptoms.
Yeah. Well, and I think on the upside, you hear voices of people who experience this. You don't have to be an expert to post something on TikTok, which has ups and downs as well, right? On the one hand, it's like the lived experience. It normalizes it, reduces stigma. And sometimes people actually post things without necessarily really fully understanding the whole picture of it. And so, like you said, you have to be a little cautious around voices you're listening to. And is this, accurate? Is this the full story? And I think one upside, and I'll just share this a little bit, I didn't really talk about this much with Michaela, is that this particular conversation on ADHD and women, I had a personal interest in this because I do experience some of the things we talk about this in my life, hyperfocus, some of these qualities that Michaela will share about, and you'll hear more about that later. And I had never considered that question for myself. And I've never been diagnosed. I've never been assessed. I think that this conversation made me take a look at some of my behavior patterns in a new light. And that is an upside, right? Is that sometimes people can have a little bit of awareness and sometimes have some better understanding of themselves and their patterns.
Well, I think what Michaela does that is so helpful in this interview is she really gets deep into what ADHD is beyond that sort of surface level and understanding that's more pervasive now on social media. And so I found myself listening. And I mean, I think a lot of us probably have traits in this day and age that we could maybe think of, like that could be ADHD. And I'm not excluded from that. But then there were certain things she talked about, such as with the hyperfocus, that I thought, oh yeah, that is not me. Like I can work in flow, I would call it that, but I would never not feel hungry for food. Like I could never miss that cue. But there are these kind of less talked about features of ADHD that I think people find surprising, possibly.
Yeah. So sometimes when you know the full story, it's almost like, oh yeah, no, that doesn't capture me. But there are elements that probably most of us relate to.
Right. And especially in the context of being a woman, how estrogen changes can affect symptom presentation. And so you touch on that a little bit, along with kind of some transitions in life that women go through where they may feel like, do I have ADHD because of this going on with how I'm thinking?
Right. Am I just overwhelmed? Something like that. Yeah.
Right. The other point where I thought, oh yeah, see, I do not fall in this category for sure. And it was a concept I've never heard of, is deadline dopamine. I mean, I actually know the concept, but not the phrase deadline dopamine, which is the idea of it, like procrastination serves a function, basically, that there needs to be that sort of rush right before a deadline to actually do the task. And I am the polar opposite. Well, I like to do things as soon as possible. I've heard it called precrastination, which has its own downsides, but it was an interesting way to relate to a feature of ADHD.
Well, and I will just go ahead and share, this is one of the things I really do have, deadline dopamine. So even in college, I would write papers like the day before. I mean, we're talking like 10-page papers the day before the due. I just could not motivate.
Do that.
And I also pack suitcases at the last minute if I'm traveling. And I'm always so mad at myself because it's 10 p.m. and I have an early flight. And I'm like, why am I not packed? And I'm stressing out. And recently I attempted to pack for a trip early. And it took me forever because I had no adrenaline. I was not stressed out. I didn't have the deadline dopamine. And I was like, this is so boring. And I mean, it was a disaster. And I was like, yeah, I think this is something that I definitely can relate to. My sister packs her suitcases like a week in advance. And I'm always like, how do you do that? I could not do that.
And when you talk about waiting to write a 10-page paper a night before, that's my reaction, is how I would be a nervous wreck. So yes, we're all wired differently.
Right. I'm not recommending that, by the way. I'm just saying that I have done it.
In case other people relate to it, they're not alone.
But it's also like, we don't need to be ashamed of how we're wired, right? Like we all kind of have our own way of thinking about the world and our own way of operating. And I really appreciate that Michaela talks about that and also gives some tips for people who, as you say, Emily, have an ADHD in their life. Yeah. If you have someone in your life who has these patterns and it can be challenging, like what are some ways that you can be in a relationship with someone who has ADHD?
Yep. This conversation is really packed with goodness. So
enjoy. My guest today, Michaela Thomas, is a clinical psychologist and managing director and lead psychologist of the Thomas Connection. Michaela specializes in perfectionism, helping high-striving women let go of the pressure of perfection to find the balance to burn bright, not burn out. She has authored the book, The Lasting Connection, and has been on Psychologists Off the Clock before, episode 254, to talk about that work. She also hosts the Pause, Purpose, Play podcast and posts on Instagram under The Thomas Connection, which has terrific content, so definitely check that out. She offers online courses and ADHD assessments and support. She has an ADHD club for late diagnosed women. And we are here today to talk about that. Welcome back, Michaela.
Thank you so much. It's really exciting to be back on this podcast. And I can't believe how many episodes you've done at this point.
I know. We've been doing this a while now. You've done a number yourself, but I think we've been doing it a little longer. I was just checking out your podcast the other day.
Yeah, I think I'm on 180 something now. So it's a few as well.
And it's brilliant. What do you talk about on your podcast? What are some of the themes?
So it's mainly talking about the intersectionality between ADHD and perfectionism. So I started talking about perfectionism, and as we'll hear in this interview today, I noticed that so many of the women who came to me for therapy or coaching or support around perfectionism or being close to burnout or having sort of people-pleasing tendencies, being very sort of stuck in overwhelm and doubting themselves and being quite self-critical and hard on themselves and really struggling with failure or being rejected by others. All of that fits underneath the perfectionism umbrella, but I noticed that so many of them were basically also undiagnosed ADHD. So that's why the podcast has kind of evolved into talking more about the links between ADHD and perfectionism.
So we're going to touch on a number of those themes in our conversation today, and that is a great resource for people who can relate to what you're talking about today and want to learn more. Pause, Purpose, Play podcast.
Yes, and hopefully we'll have you on that soon.
Yes, I'm so
Your
excited.
co-host Jill has already been on.
Oh, that's right. She talked about imposterism on your podcast.
She did, yeah. And it was a very popular episode amongst my community.
Oh, I could see that. Yeah, for sure. So I want to give a little orientation about ADHD for folks who maybe, I'm sure most people have heard that term at least at this point, but some people might not be really super familiar with what it really is. And I know there's a lot to unpack there, but I was wondering if you could just give us a brief kind of nutshell of, generally speaking, what do people mean when they talk about ADHD? What is it?
Well, it's not what you see on Instagram Reels, basically. It's quite complex, and this is why you need to see a qualified health professional to get your assessment and your diagnosis. But if you've been reading a bunch of sources online and you do recognize some of these traits that you see in these Instagram posts and Reels, going for self-identification is still very valid. If you've been reading trusted sources where they describe the signs and symptoms of ADHD and you feel that's me, and it's felt like you since you were a child, that's really important to differentiate with as well, because otherwise it might be like, well, I'm really scatty now, my brain is unfocused, maybe I'm ADHD, and it's a very recent thing. Then that's not necessarily the case. You know, I'm sure we'll go into talking more about what it means for women who are sort of finding that their brains are scattered and they can't pay attention to things. Could it be perimenopause? Could it just be quote unquote mum brain? Could it be because you're in a more senior position now, coming to the age I am in midlife, where there's a lot more on my plate to spin, right? So what I want to say first is that if you feel like you recognize some of these signs in yourself, that is very well valid. Go and speak to a health professional like your doctor or a psychiatrist or psychologist to get some more answers. But in short, ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. Now, that sounds very medicalized, and I try to be very neuroaffirmative rather than over-medical. So essentially, ADHD is quite problematic as a term. It's almost like it's got branding issues. So we kind of need to rebrand ADHD because it's not an attention deficit. It's an attention regulation problem where you struggle to regulate your attention between different things. So for instance, you might struggle to switch your attention between different tasks and be focused on them. So if someone comes to interrupt you whilst you're sitting and trying to focus on something, you might find that you got irritated and struggle to then steer back your focus to what you were doing. It could also be that you interrupt other people and you don't realize when to hold back on that impulse to not disturb others. So it's an attention regulation problem. And what that could do is it can manifest itself like you struggle to be focused, you struggle to be productive, you can't get the stuff done on your to-do list that you had planned to do. You get really overwhelmed if there's lots of things to juggle. So we can sometimes talk about the analysis paralysis, that the overwhelm you can get when you have to make decisions. So for instance, my community would be overwhelmed if they had to go and buy a new backpack and they go online and they see that there's 500 backpacks to choose from. Which one is the best one? Which one is the right one? And you can feel that you struggle to manage your energy, so that you have some days, especially for women, it would be cyclical in the month as well. But there might be some days where you feel really energized and ready to go. And then you're so wired that you sort of struggle to sleep even. So they're kind of wired and tired. And then it might steer over into a slump where you're like, oh, I can't get anything done. And I'm just procrastinating and I'm kind of de-energized. So it's kind of an issue with both attention and energy and motivation. And it comes to do with the executive dysfunction problems that is related to ADHD. Now, I don't want to be too medical, but it's to do with the areas of your brain that controls things like impulses, organization, planning, structuring, prioritization, motivation, in memory, things like that. So in short, it might be kind of easy to understand, and without being so hard on yourself, that ADHDers are not motivated by the same things that neurotypical people are. Neurotypical people are people who have the typically wired brain. Neurodivergent people, amongst them come ADHD, they're the ones who have brains that are wired slightly differently to the neurotypicals, right? So it's sort of like right-handed and left-handed people. Neither is better nor worse, they're just slightly different. And we need different tools to function well in society. So if you're differently wired and you're neurodivergent, it might mean the ADHD brain is not wired to do things based on importance, right? So you've got this thing that you need to do. That's important. Need to file your taxes, right? That's really important or you get into trouble. That might not feel important or motivating for the ADHD brain because it's wired to be focused on things based on challenge, urgency, and interest. So if you're not interested in it, and I'm not because taxes are boring, then I won't do the taxes.
I was going to say, yeah, can relate to that one.
I'm sure lots of people do. And that's even why we don't even talk about taxes as a good example in the assessments anymore, because like, have we found anyone who likes their taxes? So there might be, other examples like, anything that's sort of like life admin and adulting that can feel really overwhelming and hard. And that's where the self-criticism and shame comes in. Like, why can other people do this? Why can't I do this proper adulting? When are the grown-ups going to come and save me? And you're kind of nodding along with that. That's something that I hear a lot in my community. Obviously, I don't work just with women. I work with men as well. But primarily, I'm interested in women because of how marginalized we've been in the research around neurodivergence, because it's been primarily done on boys and men. So that's when you think of ADHD, you're like, oh, it's that kind of little boy who's got ants in his pants. That's surely what it is. Running like a hyperactive little boy. But it can take very different manifestations. And not just based on gender, but based on type. So we broadly diagnose ADHD into two different categories, primarily inattentive and primarily hyperactive or impulsive. Or the third type is combined type, when you have both.
Okay. That's helpful. I was going to ask you about that hyperactivity piece of it, because that, I remember back in the day it was ADD, then it was ADHD. And I think not everyone can relate to the hyperactive part, right? So that must be the different types.
Absolutely. And it's, for simplicity's sake, ADD is sort of what we now call primarily inattentive ADHD. So we don't use the ADD term anymore. We just say ADHD and then specifying primarily inattentive, primarily hyperactive and impulsive, or combined type.
Okay. And I'm thinking about, there's a big range of what ADHD can look like, of course, across the population and within individuals and groups. But I am curious about how it presents differently in girls and women versus boys and men. Are there some trends and some patterns to that?
There are trends and patterns, but it's also hard to say because we haven't had enough research on girls and women, because obviously that's sometimes been identified as other things. So girls and women are more likely to be misdiagnosed with anxiety disorders or depression, or even personality disorders. when there's actually to do with the underlying neurodevelopmental condition like ADHD or autism. Eating disorders are also more likely to be identified. So for girls and women, it's much more likely that they internalize it, and you get those kind of internalized symptoms like depression, anxiety, eating disorders, self-criticism, self-esteem problems, where boys and men are more likely to externalize, where you might see the explosiveness and the anger and that kind of getting into trouble. And that's obviously because of this disruptive nature of that is more likely to be picked up in the schooling system. Obviously, I just really want to emphasize that these are some trends. It doesn't mean that boys and men, can't present with primarily inattentive type, and that girls and women can't be primarily hyperactive and sensation seeking. But because of the pressure of the patriarchy of how girls and women should be, that's a lot of pressure of perfection that I work with, and that sort of good girl narrative of girls needing to not take up a lot of space, needing to be quiet, etc., that the girls and women who are hyperactive type or impulsive type, they get even more ostracized because they're acting in a way that's not seen as traditionally like this gender stereotyping female.
Okay. Do you think that it is more likely to be overlooked in girls than women, the diagnosis, because of some of these factors?
Yeah, 100%.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Now, I've gleaned from your social media that you have a personal experience with overlooked and late diagnosis ADHD. Are you up for telling us your story about that? Your personal experience?
Yeah, sure. That's been part of my personal sort of unmasking journey. So unmasking means that we are starting to be more comfortable and accepting of the neurological brain wiring we have. It's sort of similar to the process of when people come out in the LGBTQ plus community, which interestingly, there's a lot of overlap as well. This neurodivergent people are more likely to be queer. So there might be some of them having to come out twice, coming out as neurodivergent and coming out as gay, lesbian, whatever it might be. So that journey of coming out as neurodivergent can feel really difficult because you might have some really positive experiences. Like I've had lots of people being supportive and saying, oh yeah, me too. So glad you mentioned it first, especially people in my psychology community. And this came about lots around the time where I was nominated for an award, Inspirational Modern Woman of the Year, this year in the UK. And
congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, I was very pleased to be nominated, and I was even more pleased to see that I won. So that was great. But I had to sit with my own kind of ideas around unmasking, and it was really courageous. It was really bold because I had to get up on a stage and accept this prize. And I didn't want to do that without acknowledging that I have a platform in this very moment for 2 minutes. What message do I want to share with the people sitting in that room with, having the chance to talk about inspirational, aspirational messages? So I had to sit with myself and do I feel like I want to talk about the neurodivergence? And I did. So I wore a rainbow colored dress, which you can see on some of my social media and on my website, because I thought, actually, this is part of me unmasking. This is who I am. And that makes me a more understanding, more neuroaffirmative psychologist for those who are looking for support with their neurodivergence, because you're never going to get judgment and shame from me. I was diagnosed last year, so now we're in 2024. I was diagnosed early 2023. So the first sort of 6 to 12 months were the hardest for me, I think. That sort of relief and grief, as I call it, the sort of the relief of that explains so much. This wasn't my fault. The way that I've been acting, the way that I've been feeling my whole life, I was just a lost girl who was missed. And we referred to these women who are late diagnosed as the lost girls. They were sort of overlooked in their childhood and struggled through life. Some of them have been on the edge of burnout, people pleasing, all the things we mentioned earlier. So knowing that this was the relief, this is who I am, then the grief comes in as well. And I wasn't immune to that either. The coulda, woulda, shoulda. The wondering about what could life have been like had I known earlier in my life that I was neurodivergent. What would it have been like when I was planning my wedding? What support system would I have put around me when I was becoming a mother for the first time? How would my postnatal period have looked? What could have happened in the workplace had I known about my diagnosis. So that we could have, asked for the reasonable adjustments that I'm legally entitled to by law in terms of discrimination. So that piece is also hard. So after I did the sort of the relief and the grief piece, I felt I'm ready to tell the story. I'm ready to have that part of my journey. And as a psychologist, I'm sure you recognize that as well. We have tools and skills, within our repertoire that our clients don't have. And I felt like I wanted to share that. I'm a few steps ahead of my community, my audience, and I wanted to be able to share with authenticity, this is how we can live authentically without being so hard on yourself.
When you think about your own experience, what were some of the reasons you went in for the evaluation that you started to suspect that maybe this fit your experience?
I've been wondering about it for a few years, knowing that it was very hard for me in motherhood. When I was pregnant with my second, mind you, this was also in a global pandemic. Everyone else was having a hard time. But I was juggling, running a business with having a child who hadn't slept for like 4 years. So it was a hard time. And I'd had sort of anxiety on and off in my life. And I have a very bright brain, so it has a propensity for overthinking. That's the joy of being intelligent, is that you can find 500 angles where things could go wrong, daisy chaining your way into catastrophic scenarios. So I know that was also part of it. And I started reading these articles where they were linking that type of very bright and busy brain with describing ADHD, and also understanding that perfectionism can also be a coping mechanism to manage your ADHD, because if you're doing everything perfectly or attempting to do things to a very high standard, other people might not notice the chaos that is underneath the surface, sort of like a duck that serenely kind of sails across the surface, and underneath the water, what we don't see is the level of effort and energy expended to keep that duck afloat. And that is often what it feels like for my kind of high striving, burnt out perfectionists, and also for ADHD women, because I just have to hide the chaos that's underneath because of the way society criticizes and belittles and shames people for when they can't do proper adulting. So it was just gathering up a lot of those experiences where I'd be like, oh, I forgot to pay my internet bill again. And, these kind of annoying things. But when you add them all up, it builds a repertoire of failures. So I just felt like I can't focus. I can't get stuff done. And I can see what other people are doing. I went through all the business coaching trainings. I did all these things. Like, why can't I apply it? Why can't I implement stuff? I'm so bright. My brain is clearly switched on. And it was that sense of I couldn't utilize my full potential. And that's something I hear a lot, where ADHDers have maybe lower support needs, but they still can't quite do what they want to do. They still feel like they're always living a life that's not quite as rich as it could be, or feels like it's more complicated and overwhelming than other people's lives. And now, obviously, I know it's because I've been left-handed in a right-handed world. I'm actually right-handed, but my brain is wired differently. Right. So I've been existing in a world that I was never given the right tools for that. So that's where I started thinking when I was pregnant with my second, like, the world is getting more and more complex. My work is getting more and more complex. And I repeatedly have these realizations that I can't do things other people can do. Why is that? And that's when I started thinking, I want to explore it, but didn't feel like it to do whilst I was pregnant, because I didn't want any of those kind of confounding variables, like, the pregnancy brain interfering with that. I wanted it to be like, this is who I am normally. So I waited until about 15 months after my daughter had been born. And that's where it got even worse, because I'd finished breastfeeding. And so my estrogen levels were dropping. So estrogen is obviously a hormone that's involved with that. Oxytocin were also dropping. And that's where the deeper focus issues really came out. I just couldn't do anything.
Now, I'm wondering, I've read, and I can't remember the exact statistics, but that many, specifically women with ADHD, do go undiagnosed and just never go in and get that diagnosis. You did choose to. And I was just wondering if you could talk about the pros and cons of having the formal diagnosis. Like, do you recommend that for people? Are there any reasons? people might want to just keep doing what they've been doing?
I think, the standard psychologist answer is it depends, right? I think I would always advocate going for answers if you feel you want answers, because knowledge is power, and self-awareness means we can then take accountability for the things that we can change and accept the things we can't change. And that's sort of surrendering into accepting that this is my brain, this is how it works. That can take a lot of pressure off you. And it can mean that having that self-awareness means that it might be that you rejig the way you work. It might be that you're able to communicate your needs differently to your partner. Obviously, as you know from our previous episode, I'm a couples therapist as well. And I found that when couples become aware of their own neurodivergence, they can sort of talk to their spouse or their long-term partner very differently. So actually, it's not that I'm not interested in what you've got to say. My brain has gone somewhere else. So then we can kind of do things to help them have anchors to be more present in that moment. For me personally, it's made a huge difference to my relationship, because my husband is no longer feeling rejected when I've, gone off on a tangent somewhere, or like I've talked for ages, because that's what my brain does. And he gets a bit, he's had enough. I've overshared about something or info dumped on him. And I know, how can I say, I really need to info dump on you? And you're like, shoot, go for it. I'm ready. Whereas there might be times where he would then say, I can't hold it right now. Give me 20 minutes upstairs and then I want to listen. Like, it just makes it much more deliberate and conscious and aware that when we have this insight about ourselves, which can come from assessment and diagnosis, then it can open up our world. It means that you can start to embrace who you are in a way that's not your fault, and you can start to take appropriate action to support yourself, setting up the support, the systems, and the self-compassion that you need to function better. So yeah, I would always say, I'm biased because I provide assessments for a living, but I would say that the second part to that, like the caveat, is be conscious of when, because when you go into open this Pandora's box, it's going to make you think. It's going to make you reevaluate things. It's going to make you look at your own parents. It's going to make you look at your own kids. It's going to make you look inwardly to yourself. And it's going to make you look sideways at your partner and previous partners. So sort of like similar to the work that people do in AA, that sometimes you feel like you want to go and make amends with previous partners because of things you said or did when you were in an ADHD meltdown or whatever. So be conscious of when you choose to go down this route. So if you know that, you've got loads on, or you're caring for an elderly parent at the same time as your kids are going through a big transition, like maybe be conscious of, say, actually, I'm going to do it in 6 months, or I'm going to do it next year, or don't postpone it forever after. Just be conscious, knowing that you need to make some space in your life for the assessment. It's going to open stuff up for you.
So it can give you some answers and can also open up a lot to think about. And I just really quickly want to say a couple words about what the assessment process is like, because I think sometimes people are surprised. They think it's just, there's like a test. You go take the test and but it's a little more complicated than that. Am I right? There's a lot of, and I don't do formal ADHD assessment myself, but I understand there's a lot of interview history to it. Is that right?
Yeah, and there's quite a lot to it, simply because we obviously don't want to give someone the wrong diagnosis. Now, first off, it's quite common to get the diagnosis if you go and pursue assessment, and that's because of selection bias, that by the time you take yourself to assessment, you're fairly sure, based on what you've read, that there's a strong indication. And also, we do a shorter screening test before we take someone to assessment. So if I would do a screening test, a very short one-page document, and that would show no indication whatsoever of any symptoms or signs of ADHD, why would I take that person through, hours and hours of history and assessment and questions? I wouldn't. So it's almost like there's a bit of a skewed result there. That if people ask, what's the percentage of people that get diagnosed after assessment? Well, that's pretty high, because you wouldn't jump through all those hoops. ADHDers don't like forms. So if you've made yourself do some forms to get to this point, you're pretty sure that that's, it's a strong indication. So for me, it's much more about what else is there. How do I understand the bigger picture? Is there also co-occurrence of another neurodivergent condition like autism or dyslexia, dyspraxia, Tourette's? There's quite a few things in there that sort of sits on the umbrella. And some researchers also put OCD under the neurodivergent umbrella. And again, there's debate here, people put giftedness there as well, so high levels of intelligence. So it can be helpful if you think that you have a bright brain and that's why you got through school, why you got through work without anyone noticing. It can be really helpful to kind of look at a fuller cognitive assessment as well, because bright people find ways to scaffold their own brains, find ways to compensate for this in a way that means that they're better able at masking.
Interesting. Well, as you mentioned earlier, there is a lot out there on social media about ADHD lately. And there is, of course, controversy around it on social media. Some people say, oh, it's trendy. People are overdiagnosing it right now because of all these, TikTok videos about it. What would you say to them if people think it's being overdiagnosed generally?
It's a bit like this, right? During the pandemic, there were lots of people who didn't come forwards for just general checkups that could have identified early stages of cancer, because people were scared. They didn't come out to their professionals. They was like, oh, there's nothing wrong with me. And then they left it too late. So what we now see after the pandemic is the oncology services, as in cancer services, have had a huge backlog. That doesn't mean that suddenly, post-pandemic, everyone has cancer. Of course not. It's just because those cases were not identified because people didn't come forwards for routine checkups. Now, it's a bit like that. So we're not suddenly seeing everyone has a bit of ADHD these days. It's not a bit trendy. It's a huge backlog. So all of these people who didn't come forwards, who didn't speak to their providers, or were dismissed and diagnosed with other things, or told to just get on with it, or were told that they had behavioral issues, or that were lazy, or all of these other things. They might have had input for their problems, but there wasn't really an understanding of the root cause. So no, it's not overdiagnosed. It's still underdiagnosed, especially in the UK, where we can have waiting times of up to 8 years in public health services to get assessment. Hence why we're seeing more and more people like me who are providing private assessments, not because we want to roll in dough, but because we want to meet this need. It is once you realize that, oh, maybe this is me, maybe this would explain why I've had repeated burnout episodes, or why my self-esteem is always a bit on the low side, and why I'm so hard on myself, and why I'm so anxious about stuff that other people seem to just manage. Then I think that's why you've been having those things, because it's almost like we're seeing the branches on the tree, where you might have lots of different leaves and twigs and on that tree, but the root cause, the whole trunk of the tree, is your neurodivergence, and that just wasn't spotted. So people keep cutting down various branches, but they keep sprouting new ones, because that's what happens when the underlying cause is your neurodivergence. And that doesn't mean that you are broken. It just means that you have a differently growing tree to other people. So no, I think the short answer is it is not overdiagnosed. It is not trendy. And neither does everyone have a little bit of ADHD these days. It is just a huge backlog of all the lost girls, especially, who were not identified in our childhood.
Yeah. And it seems like there's more awareness. So you're a great example of this, where it's like, oh, this is kind of fit my experience all along, but I never knew there was, that this fit. You think of ADHD a certain way, and maybe that's happening with more people. I do want to speak a little bit to this idea of kind of distinction between other sort of maybe potentially overlapping conditions. So we talked a little bit about things like menopause symptoms, post-pregnancy, just general stress and overwhelm, anxiety, trauma. Sometimes responses to trauma look similar to ADHD. And so again, this speaks, I think, to the importance of getting a thorough assessment and looking at all these different factors and thinking about it over the course of time. I do specifically want to talk about that other form of neurodivergence, though, that I think is similar in some ways, which is mild autism. And to me, I think it's similar in part because it is often overlooked among girls and women, and there are some overlapping profiles. So could you speak a little bit, and I know, again, this is a complicated one, but what are you looking for to make that distinction between ADHD and mild autism when it comes to girls and women?
Well, first off, in the community, in the neurodivergent community, there's been a lot of sort of rallying around what terms to feel comfortable with. So we used to say a person with autism, because we tried to be person-centered, put the person first. But people who are actually autistic find that offensive, because it makes them feel like, I am this person with this disability, where this condition, Whereas people who are actually autistic feel like, I'm just autistic, that is just my brain. So these days we don't say a person with autism or mild autism, we say an autistic person. So we've swapped the order around, and that can be quite useful to know. If you speak to, if you have anyone in your friends or family group, or if you are a professional, that actually getting the wording right really matters, especially to autistic people, because fairness and justice might be really important aspects of them, important values. So
it goes back to the unmasking you were talking about earlier, right? Kind of embracing that part of your identity. And yeah.
Absolutely. Because masking, especially for autistic people, it takes a lot of effort for ADHDers too, but it takes even more effort for autistic people in my kind of anecdotal experience as a clinician, because they have to spend a lot of effort and energy scanning the environment to try to figure out what's expected of them. What do people want them to say? What's the right thing to say? When am I putting my foot in it? And it's like decoding a language. It's like being a foreigner, and I am a foreigner, and I'm a Swedish person living in England. So it can sometimes feel similar to when I first arrived in London, and someone asked me, how are you? And I said, blah, 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 but I was describing how I was. And that was not culturally appropriate, right? So I had to be told, actually, Michaela, what we do in the UK, you say, I'm fine, how are you? And then you walk in opposite directions very quickly. So decoding language, decoding cultural inferences like that is similar to how the autistic brain has to decode life. What's expected? What am I supposed to do here? And as you can imagine, it's like standing on the sidelines of the game and watching the game to figure out what are the roles, how do I play by these roles? It's very exhausting. So to mask and suppress all of that, and especially suppressing the urges to be in a certain way, like autistic people are, especially when they might have a need to stim. So stimming is kind of self-stimulating, and autistic people and ADHD people might stim in slightly different ways. So on my desk, I have a little sensory ball that I like to squeeze, and I've got a little ring that I can fiddle with. So kind of that helps me with the fidgetedness, kind of the restlessness. Whereas for an autistic person, it can be more about the sort of the sensory sensitivity itself. So it's not about expending energy into something. It's about, I just need to feel something in a sensory way. So it's really hard to explain what is autistic and what is ADHD, because there's such a huge overlap. Anecdotally, we see it in the clinic room. A vast proportion of people who are ADHD are also autistic, and even greater the other way of people who are autistic who are also ADHD. So I always screen for both. And then people get a choice. Do you want to pursue assessment for autism as well? Or are you happy to just know that there means that you have some traits in you that makes it harder for you to, say, for instance, see the gray areas, the nuances between things, maybe taking things very literally, maybe struggling with sort of, how should I put it? Struggling to decode intentions with other people. And there's so many myths around autism as well. That means that lots of people have gone undetected because they thought that one particular type of like subtype of autism, the way that it's been depicted in the media, is what autism is. Like someone who's completely socially inept, selfish, self-centered, don't care about the people, completely void of empathy. And that's just not true. That is not what autism is. So being actually autistic doesn't mean that you don't care about others. It just might mean that you really struggle to imagine yourself into the minds of others. What would their experience be? What would it be like to be a character in this book? I can't imagine what it would be like to be them. I can only imagine what it's like to be me. That doesn't mean I don't care about that. And I'm not saying I'm saying sort of in terms of my clients, because I'm not actually autistic. But that's definitely the experience I hear from my clients. And I think that means that it's more likely to struggle with shame around autism than it is around ADHD. Because ADHD can sort of be like, well, it's your superpower and it helps you, get lots of amazing things done. And if you can't cope with it, then take some medication. Whereas autistic, what's the medication for autism? There isn't one. And there doesn't need to be, in the sense that it's about being differently wired in your brain. So the autistic community often feel like the medication they would want is to be given to the neurotypicals so that they would understand the autistic experience better. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Give them a compassion pill and then they would be nicer to us.
Can you talk a little bit specifically about hyperfocus? Because that's a really interesting part of the ADHD, profile.
Yes, absolutely. I love the hyperfocus. It's a love-hate relationship. So hyperfocus comes back to that sense of the attention regulation problem, right? So even in our measures where we look at assessing for ADHD, there's like a little asterisk next to this question, which is struggles to keep sort of sustained attention or focus on things for a prolonged period, unless the person is interested in something. So if you're interested in something, you can focus on it forever, right? So examples would be sitting with a Lego set for a really long time, doing jigsaw puzzles, writing, like especially creativity, like people who can lose themselves in music for an hour. And it's that sense of I've lost myself in this thing that I'm doing. And when I come out of it, realize, have I eaten? Have I gone outside today? So that kind of sense that the hyperfocus overrides what we call your interoceptive cues, your body signals that you need something. Rest, food, drink, exercise, other people. It might be that you're like, I'm so in this tunnel vision of getting this thing done that I want to do that interests me and excites me, that you get a hyper-focus hangover, like I call it. So it's a sense of getting stuff done, but then the next day you crash. So you go from a frantic meerkat to a rather vegetating sloth. And that can be quite difficult if you're not prepared for those, like the ups and downs or the booms and busts in your cycles. And this is why ADHD is also overlapping with things like chronic pain and autoimmune conditions, because if you don't respect your body's boundaries, because you're in a hyperfocus, I just want to get this done, not respecting that I'm overworking, etc., then you're more likely to have ADHD burnout.
I won't get into this because we don't have enough time, but it's so interesting. I definitely have hyperfocus. I don't know about the rest of the ADHD symptoms, but I have that. And there's such a misconception that my family used to tell me when I was like a teenager, oh, you have the opposite of ADHD, because they thought, because I could literally be sitting there reading a book and the total chaos all around me, and I would be able to just keep reading if I was interested in the book. So just a quick anecdote about that. But because I think people that is overlooked sometimes, or people think of that scatterbrained attention, which I can also have in other areas. But when I'm hyper-focused, the house could be burning down around me and I wouldn't notice because I was just focused on whatever it is.
Oh, yeah, you and me both, Debbie. It's a sense of, I'm in the zone, don't disturb me. And this is also why children with ADHD who have that kind of hyper-focused stint can get very irritable and angry if they've been asked to come out of it. This is why I would certainly see my own children. But that can make the traditional schooling system quite tricky because you're asked to move on at a set schedule. You're prevented from sitting to hyper-focus in your favorite subjects, and you've been made to focus on things that are not your favorite subjects and utterly boring. And that can be boring, can feel to the point of painful for the ADHD brain. It's not that they're, I can't tolerate boredom and they're spoiled. It's literally sometimes hurts for ADHD brains to sit and focus on something they're not interested in. So yeah, absolutely. That sense of hyperfocus and having that opposite experience of ADHD. This is why so many women with inattentive ADHD are missed, because they could be that dreamer, that preoccupied, just zoned out and done my own thing kind of thing, sit and play with their own dolls or play with their own stories, whatever it might be, for a really long time. And then people think, well, she can clearly sustain attention. She doesn't have any attention problems. No, she doesn't have an attention deficit. She has an attention regulation problem.
Yeah. There's just a couple more questions I want to talk to you about. So one of the things that I think can happen is procrastination on those more boring, less interesting tasks. And I learned about this idea of deadline dopamine.
Yeah.
And how sometimes it's really hard, for instance, to pack your suitcase 2 or 3 days in advance because there's not that adrenaline rush of, trying to get it done at the last minute. And I think this kind of connects to the shame piece that you've mentioned several times, right? That I've seen a lot of clients in my private practice who I think have this quality, which is that they do everything at the last minute and they feel terrible about it. Like they're this horrible person because they don't prepare a talk a week in advance or get everything done. I mean, could you just say a little bit about that? Because I think that procrastination shame cycle is huge.
Yeah, and I'm not sniggering because it's funny. I'm sniggering because it's relatable. I mean, it's the classic thing of I just fly by the seat of my pants, or I used to, until I've put in sort of the 3 S's that I talk about: the support, the systems, and self-compassion. Because my brain is not naturally going to be wired for having systems in place, because that requires executive functioning. It requires things like prioritizing and deciding what's important and what to do in what order, which requires structure and being able to break things down. That's not really what I'm good at. So I have an assistant who helps me with that. So knowing your zone of genius and knowing that, much like a physical disability where you might need to have things to improve your mobility access, we need to have things around us to improve our access into the real world. Not the real world, but the neurotypical world. So that might mean that you need to have someone who tells you, actually, now there's only 7 days left till your lecture. Do you need me to prepare some slides for you? So I ask my assistant to unblock me with things like, give me the slides that you can do. So she obviously knows my bio. She knows where to find my Instagram, etc. And also she has templates for this because we've done many, many, many lectures in the past. So that's a really good example of how I use self-compassion to fuel me asking for help, as in asking for support to get unblocked. That requires permission. Allow yourself that permission to say, this is just hard for me. I need support. I need someone to help me with this. And that links over to the systems, right? What's our process for this? So whenever I get booked for a talk, my assistant would do all the scheduling. I don't touch my scheduling anymore. I don't touch my emails anymore because I would just procrastinate the crap out of it. So I can't be trusted with those things anymore. So I have support systems in place for that. And I have mechanisms and processes so that in order for me to run my business, I need those cogwheels around me. So those support systems and self-compassion, they all come around one aspect, which I think is so important when it comes to ADHD. Woman, man, child, adult, doesn't matter, which is acceptance. I have to accept and surrender into that these are not my zones of geniuses. I am not good at these things, and it might be that I can improve them. I'm not good at these things yet, perhaps. Kind of thinking about a bit of growth mindset in there. But some of it is also accepting that I probably will never be great at these things. And that's also okay. And
you're great at many other things, right? You have so many strengths that I think shine through.
Exactly.
Yeah. And actually, in my private practice, when I have folks come through who have the ADHD profile, which is a lot, I work so much on the self-compassion thing because I think I see the depression, the self-criticism, the shame, and sometimes even just helping people understand what's going on and that it's not a moral failure. It's not even necessarily, yes, you have to find a way to work with it, but it's not necessarily even a bad thing. Like, it comes with many strengths, but that, it's not a moral failing and that they can be kinder to themselves about it. That is sometimes I think that's quite a perspective shift.
If anything, that's the biggest shift, is coming into terms with, you make peace with yourself. This is who I am. Then I don't have to struggle against it so much. So we'll obviously in the ACT world, we talk about stopping the struggle and letting go, battling against it. So rather than be like, I should be able to do this. Like, yes, it'd be great if I was able to prepare my slides a week in advance. But I'm not, so I have to have someone to do that. And that helps me to be who I am without the burnout, without the self-criticism, and be able to share these messages like, speaking to you. I had nothing to do with scheduling you in. That was all my assistant. So that meant that I got to save all my spoons, as we say in the neurodivergent community, all my energy and capacity, saved for this, which is the bit I love doing. This is the thing that I have interest in doing, talking to you.
Right. Would you say a few words for folks who are in a relationship with someone with ADHD, someone who maybe is listening to this and thinking, this doesn't describe me, but it describes my partner, my kid, my parent, my friend. What tips do you have for them that might help them navigate?
It's the same thing there. It's the compassion. It's both compassion for your partner, but also compassion for yourself. It's hard to live inside an ADHD brain. And it's also hard to live alongside an ADHD brain. And that's saying it's hard to do. This doesn't mean that you're loving each other less. It just it's a reality check. It's just saying, this is just really hard. Sometimes you will do things that irritate me. And sometimes I need to figure out how to support you. And that can mean like, how can you bring kindness and playfulness to that? So for instance, I mean, I can give you an example from my own marriage. When I get stuck in what's called the DMN, the DMN, the default mode network, which means that you're more likely to overthink, you're more likely to be negative. You basically, your brain is stuck in an analysis paralysis. That's where we're more likely to see people being more like low in mood. And ADHDers are more likely to be in that space. It's sort of the glass half empty space. We have a negativity bias. So we're not just being pessimistic for the sake of it. We're wired that way. So we can step out of the demon by using things like movement, dancing, music. And my husband knows. So he's like, shall I just put some music on? And he knows what kind of tracks will help me, the more upbeat ones, or what kind of vibes and beats I need to have. And then he might go, what should we do first? What's the thing you're going to do first? And I go, I don't know. I'm so overwhelmed. And he's like, okay, let's break it down. And then he helps me figure out what to do. And I can sometimes be like, taking me by the hand and go into the wardrobe. First, you're going to put some clothes on. And I'll go, I don't know what to wear. And he's like, put this on. And it's sometimes it's just like this. And it's a give and a take. It doesn't mean that he has everything figured out. I do the equivalent for him, but for other areas, because we all have our Achilles heels. We all have our shortcomings, where it's really nice to have a compassionate partner who helps to bridge that gap, bringing their strengths to the table in a compassionate way, saying, okay, you haven't got this, but I've got this. And together that means that we've got this.
Yeah. And a little knowledge. I mean, it sounds like he's learned about this, and hopefully the conversation today will help people have a better understanding of it. We have really benefited from your brilliant, bright mind here, Michaela, and we can refer people to your terrific podcast, Pause, Purpose, Play, if they want to learn more, and your other work. And where can people find you online so that they can continue to learn more about the work?
So my website is thethomasconnection.co.uk. And you can also find me on Instagram, The Thomas Connection, or Pause, Purpose, Play, the podcast.
Excellent. Well, really appreciate you coming on today, Michaela. It was really a pleasure talking with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me again. And no doubt in 2 years, when I've changed my specialism again for some other hyperfocus, then you'll have me back. So,
well, that's again the creativity of having that kind of brain. There's always something new and interesting out there. And so when you discover what that is, come back to us.
Yeah, will do. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Michaela.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our newsletter and connecting with us on social media.
We'd like to thank our podcast production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.